So good afternoon for all, for our speaker, Professor Tara, our participants, and everyone who's watching us, wherever you are, welcome. It's a great pleasure to learn from you today on the state and business obligations to provide equitable vaccine distribution to all. My name is Victoria, and here as our co-organizers, I have my colleague Daniela and João, and also as debaters, Gabriele and Danilo. We are so grateful for all of you that are joining us today at these webinars. You are also a great part of this initiative to bring the business and human rights field to discussions in order to propose improvements and reforms. Through the webinars that we organize in the University of São Paulo Business and Human Rights Working Group, we seek to address the problems increased by the COVID-19, and actually our first webinar addressed the human rights obligations towards business in order to provide vaccination accessible to all. I just got vaccinated yesterday and I'm very excited to be able to debate this topic. So for sure, we will have a high-level discussion today, bringing a latent issue in the world concerning vaccination and right to health at all. This week, especially, we had a provocative announcement of the Director General of the World Health Organization, who's now calling for some kind of moratorium for at least the next 2 months. So he says that we should not accept countries that have already used most of the global supply of vaccines, use an even more of it, because while the world's most vulnerable people remain is still unprotected. So the World Health Organization saying that people who are fully immunized against COVID should not hold off on getting a third shot until more people around the world can get their first dose of a vaccine. So since the beginning of the pandemic, we had several discussions concerning the lack of vaccines, the vaccine tourism, the unequal distribution, overpricing, the vaccine negotiation, and other types of issues that surfaced. The global inequity in vaccine availability has been really stark. Like more than 80% of COVID vaccines have been administered in high-income and upper-middle income nations. The US is vaccinating teenagers at low risk of contracting COVID, while frontline healthcare workers in Nigeria, for example, are still awaiting their first shots. So anyway, the access and obligations of companies and states to provide vaccines is still a controversial stand in some quarters. And to present this challenge and the current status of discussions concerning human rights, we have the pleasure to hear from Professor Tara Van Ho. She's lecturer at the University of Essex School of Law and Human Rights Center, PhD in Law and LLM in International Human Rights Law from the University of Essex, and Juris Doctorate Law at the University of Cincinnati. All of our webinars are recorded and available on YouTube if you can stay until the end or want to recommend it to someone. And without further ado, after your presentation, Professor, we will open a quick panel for questions to involve our debaters and participants to bring their own remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you to all of you for having me here. This is really exciting. I keep promising that someday I'm actually going to make it to Brazil for one of these kinds of events. And I'm still hoping that eventually when vaccination rates are up and when travel has resumed to normalcy, you'll let me come down and hang out with you guys a little bit. I am going to present today some preliminary thoughts. And that's because I feel like in times of crises, academics need to balance our rush to provide answers with our responsibility to provide good answers. And sometimes those two things are not always compatible. Particularly in the area of human rights, I think that this responsibility is grave. And that's because there's been a lot of harm done to the movement as a whole by people who rush to be certain of their own position. And at times that certainty doesn't take into nuance or into consideration the realities on the ground. Human rights is I think I'm speaking to an audience that understands this better than I do. Human rights is often weaponized and politicized in a way to berate those who would oppose governments. And where academics and human rights academics get a little too loose, we pose real dangers to those on the ground. So I'm going to stake some claims out here today. They are done with some significant qualifications, and I'm going to try to the best of my ability, which is a little hard because I tend to talk faster than I think. I'm going to try to distinguish between what we know of the law and where I hope the law goes in the future, or what our limits are. I'm going to do this by starting with the responsibility of states, moving on to the responsibility of businesses, and then ending with the responsibility of individuals. So where the law is clearest is in our state obligations under international law. TRIPS, which is the Intellectual Property Treaty, protects the production of medicines, technology, testing, equipment, and processes for 20 years. States can issue compulsory licenses, but that's generally for their own domestic consumption. And they can collectively choose to waive TRIPS, to just say, actually, for this particular emergency, we're not going to abide globally by this obligation. And there are proposals to do that at the WTO, but those proposals actually sit in quite stark camps, and we haven't seen as much movement to waive TRIPS as we should have seen. And the reason that I say we haven't seen as much as we should have is because for some states, I think there's a clear obligation to waive TRIPS. And this is where we move from the intellectual property side of things, which I'm not going to actually address TRIPS more than what I have, because there are intellectual property lawyers who are much better qualified to do that. And I am very definitively a human rights lawyer and like to stay a little bit in my comfort zone there. But I think under international human rights law, for at least the states parties to International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, there's a clear obligation to waive TRIPS, to put pressure on other states to waive TRIPS, to ensure that that leadership at the WTO moves forward the discussion around intellectual property rights regarding not just the vaccine, but everything related to COVID-19's response. So that's the testing equipment, that's the vaccination, that's the methods of new production, everything that is related to the testing and treatment and response of COVID-19 should be waived. And the reason for that is this international assistance obligation of international assistance and cooperation, which we find within the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It's in Article 2.1. And the purpose of this is because a lot of the rights within that covenant cannot be realized without significant input of resources, as well as technological knowledge. So it's not just the right to health, which I'm going to talk about today, but also if you think about the right to education, you think about the right to an adequate standard of living, there's a lot within the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that is dependent on both financial competency as well as technical competency. And so as they drafted it, the states recognized this, and they recognized that we can only realize most human rights through some network, some system of collaboration and cooperation. But the obligation isn't just about international assistance and cooperation. The obligation is the progressive realization of the rights within the covenant. So states are supposed to take steps to the maximum of their available resources, inclusive of international assistance and cooperation, to progressively realize the rights within the covenant. It's a lot of components, but what it means is that that obligation of international assistance and cooperation has a purpose to it. It is not just to make people feel good about themselves, and that's going to become an important thing at the end when I talk about the obligations of individuals. It's not just about making ourselves feel good. It's actually about the progressive realization of the right to health. And in the context of something like COVID-19, that progressive realization means increasing vaccination rates. It means making sure that we have the capacity to have some semblance of a health response. And for a lot of states, and this is not just something in the developing world, but let's talk about the United States, whose hospitals have been overwhelmed at times. Let's talk about the United Kingdom, whose hospitals have reached their breaking points. To have capacity to address the right to health in the current context, not just regarding COVID, but also the right to health when it comes to cancer or heart conditions or obesity, all of that is wrapped up in our ability to combat COVID effectively and adequately. That means with a progressive realization. This international assistance and cooperation, the obligation as it's been interpreted by the committee that has relevant jurisdiction, has been tied to the capacity to give. So if you have the capacity to give, you are supposed to provide international assistance and cooperation. And that capacity is commensurate with your ability to give it. Now, for some states, that means that there is an obligation to actually provide financial assistance. For others, there will be an obligation to provide technical assistance. And for all, there's an obligation to work together collectively at international organizations to ensure that the law keeps up pace and reflects this obligation, that what we are doing as an international community reflects this obligation. When we talk about it in those terms, waiving trips is the bare minimum expectation, right? Like every state in the world can do that because every state in the world has the capacity to say, actually, in this particular area, for a particular period of time, with a particular crisis, with a particular set of medicines and technologies, we're going to actually make that available without patent protections. That's like the bare minimum. And then on top of that, states may have financial responsibilities and technological responsibilities. But the bare minimum that you can have capacity for in this, and that every state has capacity for, is to move forward on the TRIPS waiver. There is also a responsibility to share technology and knowledge. And this is important because some of the pushback within the TRIPS discussion is that there's just not enough facility in the global south. And if only they were better equipped, and if only their scientists were smarter, and if only they had a little bit more, then this wouldn't be an issue. But for now, just let us in the global north use up all the vaccinations that we need, and we'll give you the trickle-down effects. Just bide your time and we'll get to you. Now, I first of all cannot say all of that without noting how deeply colonialist it is, right? How steeped it is in the history of international law and international relations. I can't say that without noting that it's also extraordinarily racist, right? So there's a lot of embedding of colonialism and racism that are connected. Some of it is not, sometimes you have colonialist thinking that's not racist, and sometimes you have racist thinking that's not colonialist. But realistically, it's like if it were a Venn diagram, 95% of it would be an overlap. And that thinking is both. It is both colonialist and racist. And it's also out of touch with reality, right? The notion that you can't create these drugs in the global south, that there's just not capacity for it, that there's not, that you wouldn't have the right scientists. Well, Victoria's already talked about her vaccination. I have 2 in my arm. I know because of a legal problem here in the UK, one of mine was created in India. Millions of people in the UK have vaccines that were created in India. So unless somehow our vaccines were the super special ones, there is capacity in the global south to do this. And there could be more capacity with a TRIPS waiver. And with that, with the technological transfer. And I do want to emphasize the technological transfer. And the reason for that is a lot of this information is actually kept by businesses, right? They might provide the patent, they might provide the process, but if you need a particular piece of equipment, if you need a particular culture to be able to grow a vaccination, I'm going to admit here that my scientific knowledge on this is a little shaky, but I have enough of a knowledge about what's supposed to happen that I can say, if there's particular things, there are particular things that are being held right now by the vaccine manufacturers or by others who are in sort of the vaccine manufacturing testing industry. There's enough being held there that if we don't mandate technological transfers, there will be a limit to the TRIPS waiver. There will be a limit, not because there isn't knowledge, not because there isn't capacity, but because some of that technological aspect, some of the technology is being held by a relatively few number of corporations. And that brings me to the next part of the state's obligation, which is the state's duty to regulate its own corporations. That is, in my opinion, and I'm not alone in this opinion, an extraterritorial obligation. It is one that both the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which has jurisdiction over the, I keep saying jurisdiction, but has a mandate over the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Human Rights Committee, which has a mandate over the other aspect of our international legal system, our core treaties, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Both of those two bodies have said this is actually an international or extraterritorial obligation to regulate what your corporations do and how they impact human rights abroad. And it's an important one. It's a particularly important one if we move beyond ISESCAR and into considering that link between the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And that's because this obligation to waive, the obligation that we're talking about in the states, they will always come up against the reality that the one state that is most vehement about protecting TRIPS is also the one state that will be hardest to ever get to ratify the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And unfortunately, that's my home country, right? It's the United States, where they have embraced an extreme form of capitalism, an abusive form of capitalism. And for as long as the United States is in the position that it is as a global power, and as long as it continues to embrace its extreme form of capitalism, then what we're going to see is the United States resist significant efforts to reform TRIPS. And to utilize TRIPS in crises like this. So the United States has said that it will waive TRIPS for the vaccines, and it hasn't gone further. And that's a really difficult position for the rest of the world to accept, because if what you're doing is offering sort of something that we know has a limit because it's dependent on all the other technology that is related, there's just, I mean, why would you settle for that unless you were the United States? What motivation is there? Because the reality is that you are setting yourselves up. We as a global community are setting ourselves up for a limit to the right to health. It does become an oppressive and abusive approach if what you're saying is we're going to continue to limit really the capacity that we have to respond to this crisis. And that is unfortunately what the Biden administration has said thus far. So without the United States' support, then we get onto the businesses. This will be applicable to some of the businesses and not to others. It should be applicable to all, but I'm going to exempt discussing about US businesses because there's just no point right now. And what I'm going to focus on are the companies like AstraZeneca and Pfizer and BioNTech that are based in Europe. It applies beyond just those companies, it applies to others as well. But I want to talk about their responsibility to respect. International law does not generally talk about businesses. And so it's only been since 2011 that we've had kind of international consensus as to what we expect of businesses. And that's in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, where there's a negative construction of what we expect of businesses. They aren't required to provide us anything. They're merely required to respect our rights, meaning to refrain from interfering in their realization. This is a problem. It's a serious problem. And I think there are ways around the problem, but I think that we also need to acknowledge very firmly that respecting human rights, not interfering in the realization of human rights, suggests that there's no obligation to provide technology transfer. There's no obligation to provide vaccines. There's no obligation to provide other equipment that is necessary. There's no obligation to provide PPE equipment for front care workers. I think the way that we get around that is really talking about what it means to interfere in the realization of rights in a crisis like this. I don't think that at this moment we have clarity. But I think that we need to start thinking about how we conceive of non-interference in a situation in which hoarding of supplies, charging extortionate rates for them, charging differentiated rates for them, because the EU for a very long time, up until essentially now, has paid significantly less than countries that are much more financially strapped than the EU is. The EU was paying half of what South Africa was for the same drugs. I don't know that you can actually say that that's a non-interference in the realization of the right to health. I actually think there's a really strong argument for saying if you are differentiating your pricing in that way, if you are pricing out countries like South Africa from accessing the drug, you are interfering. Your price structure is interfering in the realization of the right to health. And that needs to be challenged. Now, the reality is I don't think that the guiding principles are the best instrument for that challenge. I think that I can use them. I think I can manipulate them. I probably shouldn't say that on a recorded video. I can find creative arguments as a lawyer here. But the reality is that the guiding principles at their heart are a capitalist instrument. And that means that they have limited expectations on businesses. They still recognize that at their core, a business's responsibility is to its shareholders. And to the extent that it can, it fits human rights into its core functions. That's why it's a negative construction, right? The bare minimum that we're asking of you is to not abuse your workers. The bare minimum we're asking of you is to not torture people. The bare minimum we're asking of you is to try to compensate people when you displace them from their homes. It's a really limited expectation on businesses. And we're seeing in this crisis, not just with the tech, but with other aspects of global supply chain management, we're seeing the limitations of that embrace of the capitalist understanding of businesses as the core component of the guiding principles motivating statements. When you accept unconditionally that the core purpose of a business is to make money, you cede all other responsibilities from the business. They become secondary. They don't become the motivating questions of the managers and the directors. So do you have a pharmaceutical company? Great. How much can you bilk South Africa for? That's a legitimate question under the guiding principles. And I don't think it should be. Fundamentally, I think the guiding principles are inadequate for structural issues like this. I think they are amazing tools for individual cases. I think I can use the guiding principles extremely well to convince a company to adopt better grievance mechanisms on the ground in their agricultural supply chain. I can use to a limited extent the guiding principles to advocate at courts for the holding of a corporation responsible for, as an example, not paying attention to threats within its mines or within its nuclear power plants that end up causing devastation to whole communities. But when it comes to the structure of entire industries, I don't know that the guiding principles are adequate. And that makes me sad because right now that's the best tool we have. And when I think about how do we address COVID, How do we think about the responsibility of states and businesses in this period of time? It requires a much more fundamental response. It requires a rethinking of our entire international economic order. How is it that we are 18 months into a crisis and we can't get states to agree to waive the science behind the vaccines or the science behind the technology for testing? That is a serious flaw in our global economic system, that we're still waiting for the United States to get on board with the rest of the world. And in fairness to the United States, we're not alone, but we're also not in great company either. That structural issue goes to a deeper heart of how we understand what the purpose of an economy is. And right now, the global international legal system is set up around the idea that the economy's purpose is the economy. And I don't think that that's right. The economy's purpose is supposed to be to serve us as people, as its participants, right? There is no point to an economy working well for economic purposes unless it is also working well, or unless it is principally working well to facilitate social good. And when we go back to the history of economic development, we always see that capitalism was promoted as this notion of the best approach to achieving that social good. It will maximize our good. It provides the greatest amount of freedom along with the greatest amount of opportunity. And in this crisis, we have seen fundamentally its limits. And that requires a significant change in our thinking about the relationship between international human rights law and TRIPS, about the purpose of TRIPS itself, about the nature of corporations, about how our supply chains work, and fundamentally about whether or not the responsibility to respect in and of itself is a sufficient expectation on businesses. The one thing I want to end with is that those structural issues, they are structural, meaning that they need to go to the heart of the law. And we as individuals cannot compensate for those structural flaws. So the WHO and the Gates Foundation have embraced this notion that we as individuals should just donate enough money to provide vaccines to cover the entire vaccination gap in the world. And so they've asked us to donate, to go on to their website and pay I think it's $5, not pounds, $5 to provide a vaccine to somebody in the world. And let's be clear, I think that as individuals, we have a moral responsibility to do that where we can. I think from a legal, practical reality solution, it's a horrible idea. Why? Because you as an individual do not have the resources necessary to compensate. And what it does is transfer that structural systemic responsibility onto you as an individual. And it plays on your vulnerability. It plays on the fear that we all have. It plays on our desire as human beings to help. And I do believe that at our heart, 98% of the world wants to help, right? Like there's 2% of people who are just, excuse my language, complete assholes. But 98% of the world are not. And 98% of the world are going to want to dig into their pockets and find that $5 to pay for somebody else to get a vaccine because this disease is scary and it's taken millions of our people. And so we all know, regardless of where we are in the world, we all know what we're up against. And it is a fight. It is a fight for our lives, unquestionably. And so we will sacrifice for that. But when we sacrifice for that, we are not addressing the core part of what's preventing a real structural, systemic, and effective combat of COVID. We are hamstringing the response because we are providing it from an individualized perspective rather than a global community perspective. And so while I have and will every now and then reach into my pocket and find that $5, I also think that it's a manipulation of us. I recognize it's a manipulation of us. It's one I fall into. It's one sometimes I gladly embrace because in a period in which we otherwise feel out of control and helpless, we can grab onto it, and that's something. But from a perspective of what should we be doing as an international community, they have led us down the wrong path, and it's up to the rest of us to correct them. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you so much again for letting me share some initial thoughts here.
Thank you so much, Professor Tara. You brought very enlightening issues concerning the challenges around TRIPS waiver, the territorial obligation to provide vaccines and unequal pricing. And I share many concerns that you brought around this topic. So before I present our questions, I would like to invite our debaters, Gabriele and Danilo, to present their reflections too.
Thank you. Can I go first? Thank you, Danilo. Thank you, Professor Tara. It was very inspiring, your lecture here. I studied the pharmaceutical sector for a while, and I've been struggling to deal with all this dilemmas inside the industry. And thank you very much for your time, for your presentation. I have three main questions for you. I would like to hear from you if the lessons from COVID-19 could reshape the way companies sees cooperation with each other, in a sense that if everybody dies, you won't have a market to sell your products at all. This is my first question. My second question is, what do you think big companies like Big Pharma could do to foster production independency in developing countries? Because in Brazil and Argentina as well, we have an developing industry that could produce, but we are very dependent on inputs. So what do you think big companies could do to improve this, if there is an answer for that? And my last question is more general. I would love to hear from you if you think that is practical, in a practical way, if it is feasible to consider access to medicine as a human right. So thank you very much.
Should I go or?
Yep.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be a respondent here, and it's always a pleasure to engage with Tara, as our Twitter conversations suggest. And I think from your presentation on what I've been thinking about this topic, I keep going back to obligations and what does that actually entail. And on that topic, I think I have 3 points that I would like to make, and also question to see Tara's view on them. So first of all, the international human rights obligations that are connected and are necessary for vaccines to be available for all, and which, to the top of my head, I especially highlight the obligation to cooperate, which states often see more as a suggestion or as an encouragement rather than an obligation. And the second would be, and also connected to what Gabriele was saying, the right to health. And what does that mean in connection to the right to science? So a colleague of mine from the PhD, he's doing great research on the right to science as necessary for public policy. So how does that also play into, combating fake news, which are so important for vaccine access, not from a capacity point of view, but from a more convincing the general public and fighting fake news. So I would also like to hear Tara's view on those two, but also perhaps on other obligations that walk alongside those. And then I also thinking about obligations. One thing that strikes me a lot, particularly being from Brazil, coming from the global South, is how some academics often focus on the language of solidarity rather than the language of obligations, and how this framing might actually be quite dangerous in some cases, because it takes away some of the responsibility, or it could take away some of the responsibility and turn it into basically philanthropy, international philanthropy, and the white savior and the European that comes to help us in the global South. So I imagine Tara would share some similar views, but I would nonetheless like to hear if you have any comments on the dangers specifically of solidarity when it comes to those sort of issues. And finally, also thinking about obligations, but this time at the domestic level, because one thing that Brazil is very particular, especially in comparison to other jurisdictions, is that we do have domestic obligations on private actors that derive from constitutional law and sometimes even international human rights law that we are able to apply horizontally. So that opens a new other realm of debate and also of mechanisms that we can enforce and hold corporate actors accountable. And I think this sort of creative lawyering, especially in light of what Tara was saying, that the UNGPs are perhaps not the ideal framework to address some of these questions. I think we as, Brazilians, global South lawyers, we should think also like, if there are other ways that are not framed usually, and that we can try to explore law, do strategic human rights litigation, and etc. So those are my 3 comments and questions, reactions. Thank you once again, and I look forward to your answers, Tara.
Victoria, should I go ahead and answer those?
Oh, yes, please, Professor. So after that, we can start another block of questions.
Yeah. First of all, Gabriele and Danilo, like, thank you so much for that. Danilo, first of all, it is nice to see you. I wish it were in person. But I feel like we've known each other for years. And so this is always fun to sort of listen to you. So Gabriele, first of all, kudos on working within the pharmaceutical and researching the pharmaceutical industry. It is a difficult industry to wrap your head around, generally speaking. And you do need more scientific inclination than I have, if we're being honest, right? Like I became a lawyer because I don't like blood and I don't like other things that are too scientific-y. Unfortunately, all the children in my family are much more likely to become scientists than they are to become human rights lawyers, which is a deep, deep sadness in my life. Unless they're watching this, in which case I'm very proud of you guys and I love you so much. So Gabriele, like, truly congratulations on doing this work. As far as, I'm going to start with the big pharma question, because I think it goes to the heart of the industry itself. Like, what can they do? Well, for starters, they can expand their production to places in the global South, right? They treat it as if it's the generosity of their heart that they're doing this, but actually it's a strategic advantage. We're right now facing not just COVID-19, but also the climate crisis. What is one of the largest contributors to the climate crisis? It's transportation. It is the international transportation of goods. What can you do to reduce your carbon footprint? Start downsizing and concretizing your operations. So this isn't just about, what can you give to the global South, which is hugely problematic framing, but it is the framing that I often hear from the industry. But actually it's, what's in your interest, what's in our communal interest for you to do as a company. And part of that is start building your infrastructures in places outside of Europe. They tend to not want to do that because it's not just an increase in costs or operational costs, which there is some, at least initially, but it gives them a little less control. They're a little bit more vulnerable to governments that they don't control as effectively as they control those in Europe and the US. But that's really what they should be doing. Also, I do think that there is room. I'm not a big believer in corporate social responsibility, as some of the people on this call know, because I think what corporate social responsibility is an abrogation of the international community's responsibility to hold corporations responsible. And so corporate social responsibility is a nice thing. It's like the icing actually, it's not even the icing on the cake. It's the ice cream that goes next to the cake, right? Like the cake is what we expect of corporations to do. And where they can, they also scoop some ice cream on top of it. And that's what corporate social responsibility should be, is some extra stuff that they do that's beyond just respecting human rights. Within that, I think there is room for CSR in this area. And that includes things like grant making and scholarship making. It includes things like facilitating your supply chains, expanding your supply chains so that they include companies that have good human rights records that are in a variety of different communities. And within that, you build technological capacity, you build knowledge. The other thing that they can do that they won't, and that becomes a bit tricky to even ask of them, and it's a really complex thing, is to stop facilitating the brain drain that they do. You know, I always find it quite interesting when I hear people like Bill Gates say things about how there's just not the knowledge outside of Europe and North America to produce things like some of the complex vaccines. I mean, most of that knowledge was imported into the United States and into Europe, right? It didn't necessarily grow up there. It was brought over. There was an importation of it through. I mean, I say this as a migrant, right? It was importations for people like me, just who have greater scientific expertise. When businesses continue to treat states outside of the US and Europe as sort of feeder grounds without any greater responsibility to the communities that they're taking people from, it creates a really problematic dynamic. It's hard to say don't hire people from India, because that's obviously A, racist, B, discriminatory, and C, problematic in its own solutions. But at the same time, you need to start thinking through how your structures, how your corporate system is facilitating a brain drain that you then use to justify the exclusion of production in places like India, right? So there has to be a little bit more consideration there. But I think some of that comes from expanding your supply chain, bridging out and thinking through and being honest about what capacity is out there, because there is a lot of untapped capacity. As for the lessons about working together, which is the other internal industry side, I have to give credit to the pharmaceutical companies on this issue, because I actually have learned a lot in COVID-19, and they are cooperating more than we've ever seen them cooperate before. I mean, that's fantastic. Build on that, expand it more, do it with a lot more than just COVID-19. Stop treating pharmaceuticals as a means of competition and start treating it as a means of responding to the world's fundamental needs. Again, that goes to this large structural change. But I think they've learned a lot in terms of the fact that sharing knowledge doesn't necessarily mean giving up all of your profit margin. I think they've learned how to build capacity together and to cooperate in the construction of new responses. They've also, I have to say, they have been some of the largest benefactors of the breaching of TRIPS without ever really fully acknowledging it, right? Like, there are accusations within the industry against various companies for having breached TRIPS in the construction of their own or the development of their own vaccines or their own technology. So they also need to sort of recognize that and advocate for a better response in these kinds of emergency crises. I think actually big pharma in many ways would benefit from some of the waivers or some greater waiver of TRIPS. So I think they should actually really look at that. I'm going to treat your access to medicine question along with Danilo's obligations question about, like, what does it entail and what are the other links. So I think there has to be an access to medicine as a fundamental human right embedded within the right to health, right? And the reason for that is the same reason that the right to water is a fundamental human right, even though you don't find it in any of the mainstream conventions, right? It's not in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And yet the committee has very firmly recognized it. Why? Because you can't have the right to food without the right to water. You can't have the right to health without the right to water. You can't have the right to adequate standard of living. You can barely have the right to adequate shelter. There's so much that is fundamentally protected by the right to water that without it, so many other rights become meaningless. And I think the same is true for access to medicines. You cannot have the right to health if you don't have a right to medicine. And so it has to be fundamentally embedded there. As far as what other obligations it entails, Danilo, you are right. It is absolutely not just the right to health. It is the right to benefit from scientific development and technology. There is the obligation for to protect the right to information. I recognize that the right to free speech is sort of a complex right? Like there are, it needs to be as expansive as democratic societies can allow it to be, and yet it also has very clear limitations and options for states to exercise greater limitations. But you can't have the right to health without the right to information, right? That's clear even within the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights general comments on the issue on the right to health. It involves a right to appropriate information. It involves a right to adequate information about the risks that you have, about the benefits that you have, about the structures and the processes that will go on in your treatment. So if that's the case, that implies an obligation on states to not simply respond to false information, but to actually regulate the corporations that are distributing that false information. So there needs to be a better response to entities like Facebook and Twitter who host disinformation. As for what other things are implicated by or connected and necessary for understanding this, the reality is, so I know that I'm a bit expansive on things of human rights, but this is for me one of the core fundamental principles of human rights, is that they're indivisible, interdependent. When you think about that, there's literally nothing that's not connected to COVID, right? So, and not connected to the right to health. You can't have the right to health if you don't have adequate shelter. You can't have the right to health if you don't have adequate water. Can't have the right to health if you don't have adequate food. You can't have the right to health if you're not free from torture, right? Like, it is fundamentally linked with everything else that goes on in our society, including the right to Social Security, because a lot of people who are laid off, or a lot of people who are afraid of losing wages if they didn't go into work, they were at increased risk of exposure to COVID. Right now, I've heard of factories in a few different countries where, because they're in lockdown, the workers have been told that either they can stay home and not get paid, or they have to come and live within the factory and just stay in lockdown in the factory. That's an impact on the right to family life. Very firmly, fundamentally, the right to family life is implicated by how we respond to COVID. It's also just, there's some serious questions there about bonded labor if you're forcing people to come and live in your thing, or otherwise risk impoverishment, right? Like their option in those circumstances is either you go and you are fully at the disposal of your employer and subjected to whatever conditions they provide within their factory, or alternatively, you risk your home and your family's lives. That is not an adequate option. That is not an adequate set of options. And so when we talk about what else is implicated here, it is everything. I am so excited that you picked up on the issue of the dangers of solidarity versus obligations, because I hadn't actually thought about it in this setting. It is a deeply dangerous framing. I completely agree with you. It is a framing that unfortunately has a long history. Almost immediately after states recognized and adopted their obligations, they have started to walk them back in every circumstance. Now, unlike other areas of international law, most notably international investment law, international human rights law was constructed with an understanding of the relationship between the individual and the community in which they operate, right? Everything about our human rights treaties has in mind the tension between the individual and the community. And so there's a lot of space for states to limit human rights, to derogate from them, if it's necessary and proportionate to what is gained for the community. That's not true of every human right, but it's true of a lot of them. It's true of most of them. And yet, as soon as they sign on, as soon as they recognize that they have obligations, not just domestic ones, but international ones, they start to walk it back. And they start doing it by suggesting that these were aspirational. They're not. There's content to them. We know what's expected. We know what the right to freedom from torture means, even before the Human Rights Committee expounds on what the obligation means, right? And they also started to walk back their international assistance and cooperation obligations, and to start to suggest that actually it's an obligation to seek, but not necessarily to provide. We don't really know what it really means. A lot of that debate actually happened before the treaty itself was ratified. And the framing of the international assistance and cooperation as it appears in Article 2.1 is to address the fact that it actually isn't that only the only the developing states, only the developed states have an obligation to give, and only developing states have an obligation to receive. It is an obligation commensurate with your capacity. And your capacity is going to change based off of context and based off of a particular factual situation. In my other area of work on international economic law, where I work on investment law, I have said very clearly in an upcoming book chapter that actually, when it comes to international assistance and cooperation, states like the US, members of the European Union, they actually have an obligation to receive, sorry, I didn't go quite this far, that's in an upcoming article. They probably have an obligation to receive guidance and instruction from states like Argentina and South Africa and Tanzania, who have been defenders of serious cases that have implicated their human rights. And so it is contextual, this obligation to provide assistance and cooperation, and it is an obligation, but it's not philanthropy. And it's an obligation because we're all intimately tied. When I talk about the interdependence of human rights, it is not just about the human rights within the covenants themselves. It's not just that the right to health can't be realized if you don't have a right to shelter, and that can't be realized if you don't have a right to information or to petition your government, but it's actually that our human rights are interdependent. Right, like my realization of human rights, my ability to exercise them fully, is in many ways tied up in yours. How much can I do? How much capacity do I have? That is intimately related to your capacity, to your ability to get a good education, to inform public discourse, to be alive. So with that, when we reduce this to an issue of solidarity, when we ask it to be a matter of generosity, it's the same problem that I have with corporate social responsibility. It suggests that you aren't, that I am dependent solely on your goodwill. And while I said that 98% of people want to help and only 2% are not good people, the reality is those 2% tend to have a lot of resources, right? They're narcissists, they're fascists, they tend to believe that they should be in control of everything, and they work to increase their power as much as possible. I won't pick on Brazil. I will say that my own country has had its own recent history of that reality. It's not even a history, like it's a good significant part of our legislature, and probably much of our executive branch all sit within that. Oh my God, I'm now realizing I'm probably going to get banned from going back home, but that's all right. We're going to keep trudging forward here. I will say that it is not appropriate to rely on the generosity issue. It's not appropriate to rely on the hopes of people being good to us, when the reality is that these are rights that we are entitled to. And those rights can only be met if there are corresponding obligations. And so as long as I have a right, as long as you have a right to health, the corresponding obligation is to facilitate that right. And for some states, that will be through the direct provision. For other states, it will be through international assistance and cooperation. But we need to stop accepting this framing of solidarity. We need to stop accepting this framing that it's assistance or aid. It's cooperation. It is about really facilitation of something better. Now, I have talked for a really long time. I thought I was going to talk for like a total of 12 minutes, but it turns out that I'm a lot more passionate about this than I gave myself credit for this morning. So obligations on the domestic level. I think there's some really cool opportunities for domestic litigation around these issues. I think there's something to be said for consumer protection law in this area. I'm hoping to see someone write more, first of all, just generally on consumer protection and business and human rights, but specifically on consumer protection within the COVID-19 era. I think that goes a lot to the issue of disinformation and the responsibility of companies like Facebook. I think there are other forms of creative lawyering out there. We can make really good use of negligence claims against. I think it requires some work, but I think there's some really good opportunities out there to use domestic law in a way that we haven't quite seen it, to push for greater access to medicines in COVID-19. I didn't touch on those, and I'm gonna sort of just leave it there with the idea that we have to do it because it varies so differently between states, but also because realistically, when we talk about business and human rights, all the cool creative lawyering happens at the domestic level, right? Like I every now and then have a nice half of an idea that gets into an article, but the reality is like all the cool stuff is happening at the domestic level, and it's happening through really cool creative lawyers. And I see my friend Danny Pamplona, who's on the call with us, is one. I know she's one of those people who thinks about the creative use of Brazilian law. And I know several more of you on this call also do. But I think that is the way to go. Okay, sorry.
Thank you so much, Professor. Maybe we can start. Do you still have time for a second block of questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's keep going.
Thank you. So maybe Daniela would like to present first her question.
Yes, well, thank you very much for this presentation, Professor Tara. It was amazing. And also Danilo and Gabriele for the questions. I have discussed a lot of Danilo about solidarity and colonialism, COVID, long discussions about the topic, which I won't get in here, but in which I'm on the same page completely. But I have another question, and it's a bit moving away from actually the topic in general, but it's a tough question actually. I just want to know your opinion about it. And it's kind of the commonplace of all my questions from now, like since the last webinars, because we're always discussing different challenges, and we are always getting to the point that we need structural changes. We need to change the way you perceive capitalism, the way we perceive the economy, the way we regulate corporations. And the more I study this, the more pessimist I get, to be honest. It's a bit sad. And I thought COVID would do something to help us think that we need to change. It did. I mean, studying at least the ESG, for instance, COVID is at least seen as something that boosted the ESG in the last 2 years. But I don't see these structural changes coming, not even for litigation, not even if the best efforts that we've been doing. And I just want to know, what do you think we should be advocating for in this point? I mean, how can we try to tackle this issue as lawyers, as regulators, as academics? How can I try to make to change the business ideas that, for instance, business, they will agree in their corporate social responsibility stuff. They will think yes, of course we're going to help, but we cannot give you all the information because either you don't have the goods to produce the vaccines, or either you don't, or either I'll give all of my secrets, and then my scientific knowledge, and then I'll lose my competitivity. And that, I think, from what I've seen from the pharmaceutical industry, that's what I got from their most arguments on the topic. And as you said, this is this, as Gabriele pointed to, this is the future. If there's no population in the future, there's no capitalism anymore. So, but how do we my question is this, it's a very hard one, but I just want to know what do you think we could be doing on this topic to actually promote a substantial change? Maybe João, would you like to pose a question?
Yes, thank you, Daniela, and thank you very much, Tara, for your brilliant presentation, and also many thanks to Gabriele and Danilo for the debate. I would like to ask something related to what you said at the beginning of your presentation, Tara, that is related to regulation. And if I'm not mistaken, I think you said that regulation should be settled or established on a transnational mandate basis, regulation towards businesses. So, and we all know that businesses are really hard targets to regulate. It's a really complex task to regulate businesses. And so I would ask you if you could say a little bit more about your perspective of transnational regulation of businesses operations, and how could we manage to put that into practice, as I think right now the great part of the regulation towards businesses operations are developed on a national level, on the domestic level. So how could we do that? Thank you very much. I think Daniele Pamplona wants to add something related to my question. Please, Daniele.
Oh, thank you so much. First, let me just thank this working group for organizing this, for inviting me and giving me the chance to listen to Tara again. It's always a pleasure and great to hear you, Tara. So I just wanted to add to João's question, because I would love to hear from you, Tara, about the fact that going back to the idea that the capitalist systems puts us in a very bad position to give those structural answers, I keep wondering, what is, if any, our way out? I mean, in international fora, in the face of the fact that corporations seem to be very or really close to international organizations like the UN. I mean, in this light, how feasible it is for states to act.
Sorry, am I the only one who she froze on? Okay. I'm going to give her just another second to see if she comes back. I know Danny well enough that I'm relatively certain I know how she was going to. Danny, there you are. Are you there?
So my question?
I got most of it. So I think you were going to ask me, tell me if this is an accurate summary of what you were asking, but how do we get to the point of regulating corporations and an international response when they themselves hold so much power, not just over states, but also over international organizations like the UN? Yep.
Perfect.
And that relates really well to Daniela's question about what do we do about the structural changes, or where do we move to, right? Okay, so I'm going to take those two together, and then I'm going to come back to Joel. And I'm going to apologize in advance, Joel, for mispronouncing your name, because I am quite certain that I have done it now twice, and I am sure that I will do it at least another 2 times. And I tried, I even listened to a whole video as to how to say your name before today's thing. I'm still pretty sure I just butchered it, so I'm sorry.
That is perfect, Tara. That is perfect. No mistakes.
I love the generosity of my friends in Brazil. All right, so first of all, Daniela, let me say, as somebody who also sometimes who is a lot more pessimistic about business and human rights now than when I started, right? Like, the more I know, the more pessimistic I am. And what I think I would say to you is what I say to myself in the moments where I just want to give up. And they happen more frequently than I like to publicly admit. And in those moments, I remind myself that we are playing a long game, right? Like, this is not we are talking about overcoming an international economic system that has been 600 years in the making. So if it takes us a little bit of time we should give each of ourselves at least to the end of our career plus 10 years, right? Because let's assume that collectively our careers will span about 100 years. Wait, I'm not old enough for that. That puts a lot of burden on you. Let's assume collectively they span 80 years. And let's assume that if we bring everybody else in this room together, we're up to, oh man, I became a lawyer not to do math, and now I'm trying to do math on the spot. Let's say we get about 500 years between us, right? That's, we're still not caught up to the 600 years of modern manifestations of capitalist thinking, going back to mercantilist beliefs. So we need to give ourselves a little bit of time to catch up and to move and shake the structural and socialization of capitalism. So don't give up and don't think that you're fighting a losing battle. First of all, you're not alone in the battle. And I think I give really good pep talks when they're needed. Danielle Pamplona can tell us whether or not that's true or not. So if you get to those moments and you need a really good pep talk, shoot me an email with set up a Zoom call. That, by the way, is that's a targeted thing to people who actually showed up today. That is not a general invitation to everyone who's watching this on YouTube. I don't expect that many people to watch me on YouTube, but I am slightly now afraid that I just set myself up to doing like 500 pep talks a year. But do reach out when you need those moments. As for where can we go and what can we do? I think the first thing is we need to reclaim some of the core governmental space that we've ceded to corporations. That's things like healthcare. The idea that private corporations that are largely funded, by the way, by governments, they are funded by the US and the UK government, that they get to sort of reap the profits of our financing of their investigations into medicines that are essential to save the population and to respond to the economic effects of the crisis, that there's no reason for that, right? And so we don't need to go far into overthrowing, or sorry, this is on YouTube, restructuring the global economy. We can start with sort of reclaiming that core central space. Another part of that core central space is taxation. It is shocking to me. It's actually not as shocking as it should be, but it's still shocking to me that we are in the middle of a space war between 3 billionaires who have largely gotten to where they are because they haven't paid enough taxes over the years. And that space where it's not just that they haven't paid taxes, they also haven't paid their workers enough. Jeff Bezos thanked the Amazon workers for helping send him to space because they helped pay for it. Yeah, they did. They did help pay for it. Not just because your stock went up, but because you undervalued them and you undervalued the workers in your supply chain. So that money, I'm going to invoke Barack Obama, despite the fact that he gets slammed for this quote a lot. Jeff Bezos didn't build Amazon on his own. And that money is not Jeff Bezos' money on its own. That money came from people. It was taken from people. And so first thing we do, reclaim that taxation space. I calculated this before the COVID crisis. I calculated that if we left all the billionaires in the world with $1 billion and we took all the rest of their excess billions, we could eliminate global poverty 2 times over. That's huge. And we haven't done anything even close to that yet. We haven't even started to think about that. Now, I recognize that the taking of Jeff Bezos' property in that manner is going to raise lots of other issues. As soon as you put the cap on, it's going to have a depreciating value on the Amazon stocks, blah, blah, blah. I get it. I understand that it's complex. I'm not suggesting that these are easy things, but I am suggesting states can tax and they should be doing more so. And that money needs to be going for a purpose. And that money for the purpose is, by the way, not the military, okay? The money, that money needs to be going for a purpose that is for the social good and needs to be servicing something greater than what it has been in the past. Now, it's hard for me as a human rights lawyer to encourage governmental reclaiming of space, right? It's almost antithetical to the nature of human rights. We are always sitting in contention with governments. And I don't trust governments to spend their tax dollars well, particularly. I certainly don't trust my own government to do that. And when I say my own government, I actually mean either of the governments, like either my home government or the one that hosts me now. Neither one of them is good at making taxation decisions. But until I convince the majority of Americans and Brits to vote alongside me in my vision of this spending, I have to accept that there are some limitations to my plan for structural reform. And that is one of them, that we do end up having to trust some of these people. But I think that that's the starting point. I think reclaiming some of the core governmental space and saying, actually, this is the starting point. You know, the global international economic order is not just intended to facilitate billionaires becoming more billionary and going into space at whim. So that's my starting point. As for how do we start to control corporations when they control everyone else? Yeah, I think some of this is a fundamental socialization issue. You know, it's why I started by saying, you know, we're up against 600 years of socialization. And that requires counter socialization. It requires every time that a bill comes up that is going to privilege the billionaires at the expense of the working class, we point that out. And we point out how fundamentally unfair it is, how fundamentally immoral it is, how it is a bastardization of our collective humanity to do that and to facilitate and to allow that reality. And I think once we do that, I think over time it's going to have, sorry, somebody just started sharing your screen. So I'm just going to warn you that we can all, I'm going to pause for a second so that this can be edited out.
Yeah, surely editing this out, but Jean, do you know how to take this off?
Yeah, I'm trying to do this.
It went away.
Okay. Perfect.
Yeah. So yeah. So I think we counter it with socialization. We counter it with better education, starting at the ground level. You know, we need to start having really true human rights education, as well as business and human rights education in schools. I know that I'm going to get eviscerated for that amongst Americans who in the last 6 months have all become experts on critical race theory, and who are going to tell you that I'm planning on indoctrinating your children. And you know what? I think I'm just going to own it. Yeah, I am. Like, I'm going to indoctrinate your children into believing that human beings matter. Like, I'm cool with owning that indoctrination badge. I think human beings matter. I think that we should tell children that human beings matter. I think we should tell them that they matter as well as everyone else around them. And we used to do that. You know, when I was in kindergarten, we were taught to share. I think that that's a huge part of this. Now, Joel, whether or not that regulation should be transnational, or what the extent of it is. First of all, I want to say that and I'm not necessarily saying transnational legislation, because I think that sometimes is a bit idealistic and optimistic, but rather extraterritorial regulation of your business actors. And the reason that I say that is businesses are legal fictions, right? You know, for me, my mommy and my daddy love each other. And so I was born with natural inherent rights. Nobody loves each other when they set up I mean, some people love each other when they set up a corporation, but I think that those people are fundamentally naive. And if they have a good lawyer, the lawyer is already talking to them about what happens when they dissolve their union, right? Corporations are not born inherently with natural beliefs. They are born because the law allows them to do so. They are only as powerful and as appropriate as we allow them to be. And we have only allowed them to be because we thought that they were serving a common good. So if you were going to create a corporation, just as my parents had responsibility for me for the first 18 years until I mean, they still exercise responsibility for me over 18 years because I wasn't a particularly good 19-year-old either. But they had responsibility for me for those first 18 years. I had to make sure that, first of all, I was fed and clothed and had clean diapers when I was a child. They also had to make sure that I didn't just go out randomly and like hit people with their car, right? Like there was some level of responsibility over me. And because corporations are the construct of the law, then the law that creates them has the responsibility to oversee them. Fundamental as that. And what that does with transnational regulation, it can become quite complicated, right? Parent corporations if you want to talk about Germany, and their subsidiaries in Namibia or South Africa could end up having fundamentally different regulations on them. And that could cause tension. But generally speaking, that isn't what happens. Generally speaking, what we have are either the absence of laws or the presence of some kind of weak laws around checking your supply chains and making sure that they respect human rights and reporting on that. And because the reporting expectations amongst the states that have adopted these laws is slightly different, what we hear from corporations is how complicated the law has gotten, how difficult it is, how you can't possibly abide by human rights, all these varying human rights laws. And I generally think that is a manipulation of minor inconveniences. What it is that they don't want to pay for human rights due diligence. They don't want to pay for the number of workers necessary to properly abide by human rights. But that shouldn't relieve them of the responsibility to do so, right? Like I don't like to pay lots of things. I don't like the fact that I have to pay for the bus. I actually think public transportation should be public transportation. But you know what? I'm a grown-up. Even when I wasn't a grown-up, my parents had the responsibility to make sure that I paid for that public transportation because that's part of the reality of the world that we work in. And so corporations need to catch up to that and start meeting the transnational and extraterritorial regulations that they do have. As for, I think I'm missing a part of the nuance of your question, Joel. So if I am, feel free to interrupt me at any point. But I think where we talk about what's really tricky is at times there can be a deep naivety amongst Western lawyers and human rights activists about the impact of our expectations on the supply chain moving downwards. And we are, even when we create regulation that's just for our own corporate nationals, it does have an impact then on the expectations that are applied to small, medium-sized or micro businesses in places like Namibia and Brazil and Colombia. And that can be significant. And so I think the way that you respond to that, the way that you respond to the potential for neo-colonialist approaches to regulation is through consultation. And here I have to admit that I've been deeply influenced by a piece by Carolyn Lishuma, who's a PhD student in the Netherlands. And she recently wrote a piece on trailing human rights due diligence laws. And there she raised the possibility of responding to this tension through greater consultation within the supply chains. Right now, when Germany adopts its law, when it did adopt its law, and when the EU is thinking about its law, the debate is largely centered in Germany and the EU. They don't bother going out to talk to the supply chains or to the communities affected by the businesses. And to the extent that communities who have been affected are able to participate, they're expected to show up to Berlin. I mean, Zoom has made that a little bit easier. COVID-19 has facilitated that, weirdly enough. But the reality is that it's a burden on the affected communities to find a way to fit into the legislative process in Germany and the EU. And that's the wrong approach. I think when we're developing these transnational frameworks, the obligation is on the states to do the adequate consultation. And again, that's going to be an obligation that's commensurate to their capacity. And if you're Germany, you've got the capacity. Whether or not you have the will or not, that's a separate question, but you have the capacity. And so I think the capacity there means that you should be carrying out these consultations much more broadly than just with the German labor force and the German corporate industry leaders and representatives. Did I miss anything, Joel? Nuance that you wanted?
That is perfect. Thank you very much for your answer, Tara. I think Victoria has a question.
Yes, we are having a very high-level debate. I would like to ask if we have a few minutes just for maybe my last question.
Yeah.
Okay, so through the COVID-19 pandemic, we keep seeing a speech on how go through this difficult experience would make companies better and more socially responsible. But this phenomenon that we are discussing, kind of this vaccine apartheid, just seems to me to further raise the veil on discussions related to CSR and ESG, as Daniela mentioned, showing us the worst face of companies, of many companies. So, I mean, the whole world is discussing now the green money and the aspects around the social dimension of ESG. And every day I've seen the news, the media saying that there are financial funds with billions and maybe expected trillions for the next years to address ESG. And there's an inexorable rise of ESG investing. And I asked myself about how this phenomenon will affect our own concept of how much we can really rely on the voluntarily of corporations. So at this time, we are discussing the International Treaty on Business and Human Rights that has been struggling to establish direct obligations towards companies, and especially in the context of COVID, it seems to have become clear to be an indispensable element. So if the idea of ESG has helped investors to fight against COVID-19, I would be really happy, but it really worries me about the moral consequences. So should not the collaboration of corporations, financial institutions, and financial funds towards vaccination and right to health be also an indicator of ESG? It will be a pleasure to hear from you on this topic. And I mean, do you think we have plenty to worry about this idea of ESG concerning all of this problem around vaccination through the world?
Yeah, that's a huge question. So I think where I want to pick it up on is, so first of all, should support for vaccinations and all that be an indicator of ESG? It should be. It shouldn't be the only indicator, but it absolutely needs to become a portion of the indicators. And I think that there is a responsibility on investors to really consider how companies are responding to vaccination claims, to the TRIPS waiver, to those kinds of movements in their evaluation of companies' ESG compliance. And here I'm going to issue a plea to my friends at the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark that they make that a part of their evaluation. I don't think that it is right now, but I'd like to see it become a part of their evaluation. But there's a bigger question in what you're asking, Victoria, and it's a really important one, which is how much do we continue to rely on investors to make the claim for us, right? There is a responsibility on investors. I wrote about this a few years ago with my colleague, Mohammed Al-Shalil. We have an article out there on the responsibility of mutual funds. And while it very specifically looked at how the guiding principles would work within the mutual fund industry, where corporate structures are sort of weirder than corporate structures are normally, it has broader applications to investors generally, because from its starting point is that all institutional investors, because they're commercial actors, have human rights responsibilities. And so that responsibility to respect for investors means to not contribute financially to corporations that routinely abuse human rights or routinely interfere in their realization. I then picked up on that again in a report with the Essex Business and Human Rights Project on investor obligations within, or investor responsibilities within occupied Palestinian territories. And there we really try to look more at when do businesses trigger a responsibility to divest? When is there a responsibility on investors to divest from a corporation because the corporation itself is so intricately linked to severe human rights violations or severe human rights harms that can't be remedied and need to be prevented from the outset. That just generally investing in those kinds of companies would actually trigger would trigger responsibility to provide reparations and remediation because they constitute a cause or contributing to the violation itself. And while I feel proud, if I can say that, of both of those pieces, I also have to say that I'm frustrated because it is still being treated as if these investors are saving us, as if the investors are doing us a favor, as if we should trust in the investors to do this work for us. And just as I have a general distrust of governments, I have a general distrust of corporations, and I don't think that ceding that ground, allowing for investors to set the conditions by which we evaluate whether or not a business is sufficiently bad enough that it requires divestment or sufficiently good enough that it requires an extra investment. That's not an appropriate place for our regulatory framework to sit. When I said before about the need to reclaim government space, that's the very basics of it, right? Like we have a state obligation to regulate. At the very fundamental of that, the very minimum that we expect of our states is to put in place regulations that businesses respect human rights, and that includes institutional investors. Allowing them to set their own criteria, allowing them to set their own conditions is to give away that power. It's to abrogate our responsibilities. It's for the state to breach its responsibilities. And so I think we need to really think through, what does it mean to regulate institutional investors in these spaces? How do we hold them to account for their investment decisions? How do we take that S part of ESG and really make it an HR, right? An HRE, human rights in the environment. I'm not really sure. Like I want to be able to have answers for you guys for all of these questions because they're so fundamentally important. And I think you've just hit the limit of my creativity today, because I know that we need to do it, but in terms of the how, that's a bigger question. But the should we, do we need to, that part, you hit it on the head, right? Like it is deeply problematic to be relying on corporations, any corporations, and that includes institutional investors, to do the work that is fundamentally the state's obligation, and that is fundamentally in the interest of all of our society.
Thank you very much, Professor Tara. Your answers are all very inspiring for all of us. And we had a very high level debate today with so many challenging questions that certainly we will improve our understanding of human rights obligations towards companies, especially in this context of COVID-19. There are a lot of moral questions behind this problem of vaccines. And it was a really great presentation that raises us these important questions on this topic. So thank you so much. In the name of the Business and Human Rights Working Group, we thank you so much for the presentation and for your time. I want to thank you so much to Professor Daniele Pamplona for joining us today too. And just remember that we will have the pleasure to learn from her too in the next webinar. And many thanks to our debaters, Gabriele and Danilo, my colleagues, Daniela and João, Professor Eduardo, and all of our participants. We look forward to have all of you in the next webinars too. Thank you again, Professor Tara.
Thank you guys so much. This was such a pleasure to be a part of.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Professor.
Bye-bye.